Year 395 AD. The Roman Empire appears invincible, but cracks are already visible. In the west, barbarian tribes cross the frontiers. In the east, a young emperor of barely 18 years, Arcadius, sits on the throne of Constantinople. Insecure, fragile, and inexperienced, he is the perfect target for those who wish to rule in his place. Among all the contenders for power, an unexpected figure emerges. Not a general with victories, nor an aristocrat from a noble family, but a man marked by mutilation and servitude. His name, Eutropius. He had no lineage, he could leave no descendants, and yet he achieved what no other eunuch ever would, becoming consul of the Eastern Roman Empire and the true arbiter of the court. How did he do it? How did a castrated slave come to command armies, dictate laws, and manipulate an emperor? This is the chronicle of a brilliant rise, sustained by cunning, and of a fall so brutal that it was engraved as a warning in the memory of Rome. Stay until the end, because you will discover how Eutropius' greatest triumph was also the beginning of his downfall. In January of 395, the death of Emperor Theodosius I the Great shook the foundations of the empire. With him disappeared the last sovereign capable of keeping the Roman machine united under a single authority. His final decision was to divide power between his two sons. Honorius, still a teenager, received the government of the West with its capital in Ravenna. Arcadius, only slightly older and without military preparation, inherited the throne of the East in Constantinople. The difference between father and son was abysmal. Theodosius had been a soldier emperor, able to impose himself on the battlefield and in religious councils. Arcadius, by contrast, lacked the resolve and initiative his office demanded. The court noticed immediately, a young, timid, and characterless emperor was a gift to those who sought to rule the empire from the shadows. In Constantinople, the power vacuum attracted a multitude of rivals. Generals demanded influence, bureaucrats competed to control taxes, and the eunuchs of the palace sharpened their strategies in silence. Among them, one man stood out for his ability to read the weaknesses of others, Eutropius, head of the Imperial chamber. The stage was set. Arcadius wore the crown, but others would play the real game. And on that board of intrigue, Eutropius was about to make his first great move. Decades before reaching the corridors of Constantinople, Eutropius was nothing more than an anonymous child in a village of Asia Minor. His life changed brutally when he was captured by slave traders. In the Eastern markets, he suffered the mutilation that would mark his destiny, castration. In late Roman mentality, this tragedy placed him in a special category. Eunuchs were seen as ideal servants within the palace because, unable to start families or inherit, they were believed to have no dynastic ambitions. This supposed neutrality made them useful for guarding secrets, managing wealth, and serving as intermediaries between the emperor and the court. In reality, the condition of eunuch became a political weapon. With no wives or children to protect, their only means of survival was to accumulate power. Eutropius understood this logic from an early age. He cultivated the image of an obedient, devoted servant, someone with no personal interests, while perfecting his ability to listen, observe, and remember. In the palace, where every gesture could be interpreted as treason, he learned to move like a shadow, always present, but never threatening. During the reign of Theodosius I, he earned the trust of high officials thanks to his skill in handling administrative matters efficiently. But his true talent lay in reading human weakness. He knew whom to flatter, whom to grant favors, and when to remain invisible. When Theodosius died and Arcadius inherited the eastern throne, Eutropius knew his opportunity had arrived. The new emperor, insecure and lacking character, desperately needed someone to think for him. And Eutropius, with his mixture of cunning and apparent humility, was ready to take that place. When Arcadius assumed the throne in 395, he was barely 18 years old. He had inherited from his father Theodosius the Great an empire in crisis, threatened by barbarian invasions and torn apart by internal rivalries. But Arcadius was no warrior like his father, nor an experienced politician. His character was fragile, timid, and he preferred the comfort of gardens and courtly ceremonies over the harsh decisions of government. Into that vacuum of leadership stepped Eutropius. The eunuch understood from the very first day that the best way to dominate the young emperor was not through force or confrontation, but through psychological manipulation. In audiences, he always presented two apparently clear options, simplifying complex problems into easy choices. He did it so subtly that Arcadius believed he was making his own decisions, when in reality he was merely repeating what his advisor had planned. Eutropius also knew how to exploit Arcadius' deepest fears, the terror of appearing weak and the obsession with being outshone by more capable men. Whenever a general or senator tried to influence the emperor, Eutropius would discreetly remind him that they might be seeking to manipulate him, reinforcing the idea that he, and only he, was his most loyal defender. Little by little, Arcadius stopped trusting any other voice. The generals spoke to the emperor, but their advice was filtered through Eutropius. Senators traveled from Rome, but their petitions first passed through the eunuch. Even the imperial speeches that seemed to demonstrate firmness were in fact written and rehearsed under his supervision. To the eyes of the people and the court, Arcadius appeared to be transforming into a confident ruler. But behind that illusion, the real power lay in the hands of a man who had never raised a sword nor commanded an army, the eunuch who pulled the strings of the empire from the shadows. Eutropius's rise seemed unstoppable, but within the palace a force was beginning to take shape that could challenge him. In April 395, Arcadius married Eudoxia, daughter of the Frankish general Flavius Botto. Young, ambitious, and politically shrewd like her father, the empress was not willing to be a decorative figure. Eutropius believed he had secured another piece on his chessboard. He himself had promoted the marriage, convinced that Eudoxia would be a docile wife, a foreigner grateful for her elevation to the throne and dependent on his guidance. What he had not foreseen was that this woman possessed a fierce political instinct and a patient strategy. In the early months, Eudoxia watched carefully. She saw how every decision of the emperor passed through Eutropius's filter, how the courtiers treated him as the true authority, and how Arcadius seemed to repeat ideas that were not his own. At private dinners, she began to sow doubts. With seemingly innocent questions, she asked for explanations about taxes, troops, or treaties. Arcadius, in trying to respond, realized he had no arguments of his own, he had merely followed the eunuch's suggestions. The empress never confronted him directly. Instead of attacking, she offered alternatives, showed letters from merchants, repeated complaints from senatorial families, and shared concerns of military officers. Her goal was not to discredit Eutropius immediately, but to make the emperor feel that his advisor was hiding information from him. The first open clash came in 397, when Eutropius advised making peace with the Visigothic leader Alaric, granting him land in exchange for peace. Arcadius, encouraged by the doubts his wife had planted, asked the generals present for their opinions and questioned the proposal. Eutropius's visible irritation was a fatal mistake. For the first time, the emperor saw him as someone who did not respect his authority. From then on, the relationship changed. Arcadius began to listen directly to his wife and some officers, and Eudoxia seized every opportunity to weaken the eunuch's influence. What had once been absolute power began to fracture. Eutropius, overconfident in his apparent invulnerability, failed to realize that the real danger did not come from armies or senators, but from a woman who knew her husband better than anyone. In the year 399, Eutropius reached the peak of his political career. After years of ruling from the shadows, he made his most ambitious and risky decision of all, to become consul of the Eastern Roman Empire. The consulship was the most prestigious office in the Roman system, traditionally reserved for senators of ancient lineage or victorious generals. For a eunuch to aspire to that magistracy seemed like political blasphemy. But Eutropius knew there was no written law that forbade it. It was a barrier of tradition, not of law. For months he worked in silence, preparing the ground. First, he introduced the idea in private conversations with Arcadius, presenting it as a gesture of gratitude for his unwavering loyalty. Then he discreetly launched a campaign among courtiers and jurists, arguing that his appointment would symbolize a new era in which merit triumphed over blood. Arcadius hesitated, but eventually gave in. And so, in a solemn ceremony held in Constantinople, Eutropius was invested as consul. The event caused a sensation throughout the empire. The Senate in Rome sent a furious protest, the generals whispered about the humiliation of traditions, and the people were divided between astonishment and scandal. For Eutropius, it was his supreme triumph. He walked through the palace corridors dressed in a consular toga, convinced that he had broken a barrier that made him invulnerable. But what he did not understand was that this elevation also marked the beginning of his downfall. By obtaining the magistracy, he ceased to be merely an influential advisor and became a figure who directly challenged all the estates of the empire. He was now responsible for military and financial decisions, and every mistake would be attributed to his name. Eudoxia, who until then had worked with subtlety, understood that the time had come to act with greater force. The consulship that was supposed to consecrate him as the most powerful man in the empire would become the stage where the fragility of his power was exposed. What seemed like the coronation of a life of intrigue turned into the trap that would lead to his downfall. The summer of 399 brought the challenge that revealed the true weakness of Eutropius. In Phrygia, in Western Asia Minor, Tribigild, a federated Ostrogoth commander in imperial service, rose in arms. What began as a protest over misallocated lands and delayed subsidies quickly turned into a large-scale revolt that threatened to destabilize the entire Eastern Roman Empire. Eutropius, newly invested as consul, underestimated the seriousness of the uprising. Convinced that it was a minor unrest, he ordered negotiations instead of preparing a strong military response. He sent envoys with promises of limited concessions, hoping to quell the rebellion without exposing weaknesses. But Tribigild was no mere barbarian chieftain, he was a strategist well aware of the divisions at court. He rejected the offers and, in an act of absolute contempt, executed the imperial envoy. The news fell like lightning in Constantinople. A barbarian leader had humiliated the empire and, worse still, the consul who represented it. Confidence in Eutropius began to crumble. Roman generals, already resentful of taking orders from a eunuch, accused him of incompetence. The people whispered that the gods were punishing the empire for allowing someone like him to reach the consulship. Eudoxia exploited every mistake. In private audiences with Arcadius, she did not need to attack the eunuch directly, it was enough to point to reports of defeats, refugees fleeing devastated cities, and senators demanding stronger measures. Arcadius began to associate the empire's insecurity with the influence of Eutropius. The rebellion spread. Cities fell one after another, soldiers deserted, and the imperial treasury was drained by failed campaigns. Political pressure became unbearable. Eutropius, who months earlier had walked in the purple toga as a symbol of his absolute power, now found himself isolated, singled out by all as the cause of the disaster. The man who had dominated Constantinople with intrigue and cunning now faced, for the first time, an enemy he could not manipulate with words or control with favors, open war. And that war was about to destroy him. The autumn of 399 marked the end of Eutropius's power. Defeats at the hands of Tribigild piled up, and outrage in Constantinople reached unbearable levels. The people, who months earlier had looked upon him with curiosity as the first eunuch consul of Rome, now cursed him in the streets. The courtiers who had once sought his favor now avoided him with the same fervor with which they had once flattered him. In the imperial council, Eudoxia delivered the final blow. She presented Arcadius with the complaints of generals, senators, and citizens, all pointing to a single culprit, Eutropius. The emperor, cornered by fear of losing his throne and convinced that the survival of the empire required a sacrifice, made his decision. The eunuch would be stripped of all his offices, his properties confiscated, and he himself expelled from the palace he had dominated for years. The fall was as swift as his rise. In a matter of hours, Eutropius went from the most powerful figure in the east to a fugitive. Desperate, he sought refuge in the church of Hagia Sophia, clinging to the high altar. There, under the shadows of the sacred mosaics, he invoked the right of ecclesiastical asylum, one of the few traditions that could still stop the imperial sword. For days he remained in the temple, surrounded by soldiers awaiting the order to arrest him. The scene was paradoxical. The man who had manipulated laws and customs to achieve impossible power now depended on those same traditions to save his life. In the corridors of the palace, Eudoxia moved with calculated calm, pressing Patriarch John Chrysostom to accept a compromise that would allow punishment of the fallen man without violating the sacred character of asylum. Finally, his exile to Cyprus was decreed. Eutropius clung to this fragile salvation, but inside he knew exile was not mercy, it was the prelude to an even darker fate. Exile in Cyprus seemed, at least outwardly, a dignified end for a man who had risen to the summit from nothing. There, on an island of serene beauty and ancient temples, Eutropius was to live in isolation, far from the heart of the power he had ruled for years. But solitude and humiliation consumed him quickly. The news arriving from Constantinople was unbearable. Eudoxia shone as the true force behind the throne, while his name was cursed in squares and taverns. Unable to accept irrelevance, Eutropius made his final mistake. He fled Cyprus and sought refuge in the camp of Tribigild, the very barbarian chief whose rebellion had precipitated his fall. The irony was brutal. The man accused of incompetence for failing to control the barbarians now surrendered himself to them, offering his secrets as currency for survival. Tribigild received him with caution, but immediately understood the value of having a former consul of the empire in his tent. Eutropius knew the supply routes, the intrigues of the palace, and the weaknesses of every Roman general. When news of this alliance reached Constantinople, the reaction was swift and devastating. Arcadius, who had once spared him with exile, now felt betrayed in the most personal way. Eutropius was no longer a fallen courtier, but a public enemy of the state. An imperial edict declared him a traitor and promised a reward for his capture, dead or alive. The eunuch's fate was sealed. After Tribigild's death, murdered by his own men bribed by imperial agents, the rebels' allies handed over Eutropius in chains in exchange for pardon. The man who had once walked through Constantinople in consular purple now returned to the capital as a prisoner, escorted amid insults and spittle. The trial was brief and exemplary. No one dared to defend him. He was charged with treason, conspiracy, and corruption. The sentence was public execution in the Hippodrome of Constantinople, the very place where he had once celebrated his political victories. In January of the year 401, before an enraged crowd, Eutropius was beheaded. The people, who had once feared him, now shouted with joy as his head fell. His name was forever marked as a warning: no power, however high it may seem, is eternal. The Senate decreed laws prohibiting eunuchs from ever again holding consular magistracies, sealing forever the exception that Eutropius had embodied. His rise and fall became an immortal lesson about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragility of power built on manipulation.